So I'm going to talk about local informatics efforts, and we're moving to the national. And so I've given my hooking up people on informatics analogy. We're now moving to how we lure researchers to want to conduct national research. The bottom line of this effort is it has a goal to conduct a randomized comparative effectiveness trial that's going to recruit from over 100 million people this year, and it's an 18-month project. So if people see me talk before, I've given the analogy that everybody who wants to do research wants to get data to answer their question, no different than going fishing. And what's changing now is we've built a fishing pond we call Heron here at KU, but nationally, the national research objectives led by the Institute of Medicine want to move to learning healthcare systems, where the data and the systems people use to provide care can be directly used for research. So that's going to require organizations kind of shifting from separate EMR systems, separate billing systems, separate research systems pocketed around, and figuring out how you use it as an integrated environment. So this is a vision, but the vision is now becoming a reality because there's funding for it. There is a new institute called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute that's part of Health and Human Services, just like the NIH is. And they announced in April they were going to fund two types of networks. They were going to fund networks centered around health systems, which is us, and they funded patient-powered networks, which are groups of activated patients interested in contributing towards this national objective. And everybody has to be committed to interoperable information, data, and really a willingness to collaborate at a national level with other people. This is our network. So our network goes from San Antonio up to Minneapolis and the Marshfield Clinic. So we've got 10 partners in our network, and they're largely centered around academic medical centers like us. So with that, I'm going to give you the analogy here. So heron's a bird. The jayhawks are birds. So I've got my new bird analogy, and that is, has anybody seen a prairie chicken before? Show of hands. Okay. So let me, not a lot of people, okay, so some people have not. So let me just go to the video. Okay. So this is the prairie chicken. So now these are male chickens, and these are not unlike academic medical centers. They're all trying to attract the same researchers and compete for resources and research, okay? But if you look at the prairie chicken, for them to get together to attract the female chicken, they have to come to a common ground called a lek, and it's a nice clearing in the field. So you can be the most fancy male chicken, think you're really good, and this is the female chicken. So this is the goal of the male chicken. So that's Paul Terranova right there. And he wants to get a researcher like Christy Beffert to come and do research at his institution and not go to another institution. Well, notice how nice he dances there. Okay, so he's dancing, he's moving around, he's showing us stuff, oh, look, oh, please come to KU. We really want you to form a NCI-designated cancer center. Oh, I'm not so sure about that. So that's really the challenge, is naturally the impulse of each academic medical center is there's no way I want to share data because I want to show that I've got the prettiest cheeks that are puffed up, and I'm much better than that guy. But you aren't going to compete in national research unless you come together, because Pecori says we don't want people who just want to puff up in their own little spot. We want people to come together. So this project, while it's based on technology, is a lot about fancy footwork and how people will come together to do research. So with that, a lot of the work we're doing is really around things that have nothing to do with data. They have to do with how do we get IRB governance in place so that people will trust each other, be willing to share information, and conduct the research. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Is it similar to the NDNQI nursing database?
It's similar in the sense that you're combining data nationally, but it's different in that it's much more types of data, and it has specific goals to say, if with NDNQI, and I apologize if I misrepresented, they're collecting quality data on nursing units essentially to say how many nurses do you have? Are they satisfied with their employment? And now they're starting in NDNQI to get into like actual quality measures. Do you have a lot of pressure ulcers? What's different about this is they want to be more broad to kind of get all types of data, but then not just study the data. They actually want us to build a network where they can collect outcome measures from patients. So get direct input from patients and then actually conduct a trial. That's really the third leg, which is the most interesting, is how could you actually do a trial in the clinical workflow so that a patient they might look at the record and say, this patient will be great for a trial of Lou Gehrig's disease. And then we would be more seamless to make the patient aware of the trial, be able to enroll in the trial. And the trials are different than your classic drug development, new drug versus sugar pill trial. They're trials that are called pragmatic trials. So they're typically the things that don't get funded by industry and by the NIH. They're looking at things like, we already have 5 drugs on the market to treat a condition. What one is best based upon the real outcomes patients are interested in? Good question. Uh-huh.
On your last slide, you had something about shared IRB governance.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of have a two-part question. One, is the governance really that different across each of the different institutes that are part of your network? Because I know there's federal regulations around that. And do you anticipate needing to have some sort of network-wide IRB?
That's a great question. So we actually, Steve Fennell and I and Karen Blackwell went up to Chicago Thursday night and Friday, where we had our first IRB shared meeting. Because what you have to do, and we had the IRB equivalents of Karen at the meeting from each of the 10 sites. And what we have to agree to is when, let's say, Alan Greiner wants to use this network, he's got to know he doesn't want to have to negotiate with 10 different IRBs to submit his protocol to each one. So some places do these where they create a centrally funded IRB, but the model we're applying, which is based upon work coming out of Wisconsin and Minnesota and the upper Midwest, is called reciprocal deferral, where the network as a whole would look at the protocol and make a very quick determination to say, we recognize that Dr. Greiner is a KU. KU's IRB is very familiar with the type of research he wants to do. We will defer to their approval. They may look at other approvals and say, for example, if you had a proposal coming out of Marshfield Clinic in the upper Midwest, it's more of a small town rural environment, and it was a trial by an investigator who wanted to do maybe urban or Latino research, they might say, well, you know what? Great trial, but let's have an IRB that's more familiar with urban or Latino issues help supervise the trial. So our approach is going to be a reciprocal deferral model. Good question.
You mentioned the importance of attracting researchers. Can you give some examples of strategies you would use to attract researchers?
That's a great question. Yeah, and we've been starting to think about this. You know, fundamentally what's going to attract people is data. So what would attract people, and that's one of the things to keep in mind when you set up these networks, is while it's an infrastructure proposal to bring the data together, we have to figure out how we market this to people to know. So some of the things we're doing actually is we've created a website where it doesn't have any actual patient data, but it shows all the things that are available in each of the data repositories. So my analogy here is it's like you see the Chinese menus in a major city that you might want to order from. You can't actually get any data out of it, but you at least get to know how rich the data are. What will also make it attractive to researchers are things like a smooth IRB reciprocal deferral model and really proving, doing some trials to show, look how easy it was to do a trial in the GPC. And we want this to not just be a network for our community of researchers, but it's designed to be a national resource so that our patients, our communities of health here, might benefit from an idea that comes out of Oregon or California.
Is it on? Oh, hi, Dr. Waitman. I'm Lisa Ogawa from the School of Nursing. Would we consider the possibility of our student population being able to use this data, such as our doctoral students from our various programs across the campus and inter-campus wide? Would that be a consideration?
It is, and so if you look at it today, have you heard of our Heron project currently?
Yes.
So we have a process there where students can basically be sponsored by faculty to use the system. We are working to develop, since we just got funded on Friday last week, to develop an equivalent data sharing agreement so that faculty could sponsor students. Initially, what we're looking to do is say, look in your own backyard first. So what will happen is people can kind of look in their data repository, formulate the question, identify the cohort, and then they'll submit to say, I've defined a population of ALS patients. Lou Gehrig's disease is our rare disease. Then they would want to turn around and say, okay, what's it look like in Milwaukee? What's it look like in Omaha? What's it look like in Dallas? So it's designed that under the supervision of faculty, students, because in many cases I've found the students, especially in nutrition and physical therapy, really have the time to help refine and drive some of these data-driven research topics.
Okay, so how are you going to address the public perception of privacy when you're soliciting people from their data?
So the public impression of privacy, good question. So what you see today is each of us in this network already have these data repositories. We actually have a patient engagement strategy led by Lauren Aronson and Kim Kimenow. And there is our representative for our network nationally is a lady named Cheryl Jernigan, who works a lot with the cancer population in town. And we are developing essentially a patient advisory committee to help guide or be a consultative activity to both the data warehousing activity and also the comparative effectiveness trial activity. So the strategy is not just that we have the data, it's actually how do we actually let the public know and ultimately have the public drive the questions. PCORI is very interested in not where a researcher comes up with an idea on their own, but actually where it's developed from the beginning with the patient. So our strategy is really by accomplishing the goals of PCORI, which is patient engagement, that's kind of the attack, is to make it very transparent on what we're doing as a network.
Follow up to Adrian's question on attracting researchers. Is the idea to attract researchers to someplace in the network of 10, or, I mean, I'm thinking about, are there non-compete clauses within the 10? Could you do camp rating within the 10, or is your main interest attracting folks that are not within the 10 institutions now?
Well, it's really to attract and support national research. It's as a network, our goal is to be ambivalent to where they're coming from. Now, practically speaking, the people who are at one of the 10 sites, or there's 11 of these funded networks around the country, if you're at one of the sites that is doing PCORNet, you as a researcher, if you want to do national comparative effectiveness research, you may have a head start on an institution which isn't part of a network. But our commitment to the funding agency and to the goal is we are building a resource that should be very good for our researchers, and it'll empower our researchers. What happens a lot is even though you're studying something that might be a common disease, by the time you exclude criteria or you think you may want to look at more of a rare event, it's very hard to come up with generalizable results at one institution. So it creates a resource for our investigators to work amongst themselves, but also for national research to come in to our site. So as I look at it as a network, we want to be transparent and basically set a field that many people can use. But clearly the investigators that are already at the LEC are probably going to have they're having a running start on using this type of resource. That is why it's a $7 million grant. So really, a lot of people who are funded on this are not informatics folks, and they're just like, oh, the magic is going to happen. But the hard work, there's really an ace in the hole, which is has anyone heard of meaningful use or health information exchanges and the HITECH Act? So we've poured, while this is a lot of money, don't get me wrong, it's like a $100 million project across the country, it's a drop in the bucket compared to how much money people have spent implementing EHRs. And so this is really a test to say, are these EHRs meaningful? Because the first part of adopting EMRs was just get it so the darn physicians and nurses actually put data in it. The next part, as meaningful use ratchets up, it's are you putting it in and have you mapped it to interoperable standards? So this is really testing meaningful use. So our plan, and it's guided by a guy named Jim Campbell, who is a professor at the University of Nebraska, who is on one of the largest international standards called SNOMED, is for us to look at the EMRs, what are the standards for meaningful use that they should be moving to, and then as we harvest this data, so this, if I could show the slide real quick, we basically have data coming from things like your billing sources, your EMRs, and going into these repositories. And then we're going to be harvesting the paths or the concepts that are used to store that data and then analyzing it across sites to say, body mass index, gee, that's recorded 5 different ways in Kansas and 3 different ways in Omaha. Now we want to standardize that. And the reason why we hope it will be effective is we're not just doing it in isolation of a concrete problem. We're doing it driven initially by 3 what we call informatics-wise use cases. So we've got experts in breast cancer defining the data they need to characterize breast cancer. Rick Barron here is leading the group to define for Lou Gehrig's disease, what are the things we need? And then Dan Hale in San Antonio is defining what do we need to really understand obesity. Now, it's not going to be everything, but it's going to help ground us in saying, let's start with 3 concrete examples and find out, how interoperable is this stuff really. Great question, Jameson.
One more?
Just another kind of technical logistics question. Are you actually combining all these different repositories in each area in your network into one huge one that everyone will have access to?
That's a great question. Back to the slide real quick. So that's another thing that gets around trust and sensitivities. What we're proposing to do, if you look at this picture, we have what's happening in the site. So the sites, the 10 sites, they are the ones that have the big data repositories that they already have. And what we're saying is they need to implement these little red components to be part of the network. So they need to be able to share their concepts with us, not the data, but kind of how do you organize your data. When a trial comes along or somebody wants to do an observational study, they need to have a little widget that will extract the de-identified data. They need to have their governance processes and oversights kind of similar to our Heron oversight process with people like Terry Risconi on board. When we want to do a trial or collect what are called patient-reported outcome measures, we need to be able to configure these at the network and national level to then deploy into the local environment. And then when you're doing a trial, you don't need just de-identified data. Limited data, what's called a limited data set, meaning it's fully de-identified except for the times are the right times so we can monitor trends. We'll need to extract those. So the way our network is designed is the data lives at the main sites, but then when the specific request comes along, the requests will pass through to the sites, the data will come back out, which is really no different than what happens today for multi-center trials. We're just going to be a little more transparent about it, and hopefully we'll have more data available to make it lower cost and have richer data.
Russ, thank you so much. I mean, this has been fascinating. It's very strategic and innovative to take actual data that we've been working on in a huge national effort and try to make it more effective in terms of patient outcomes. It's amazing. But with that, this huge effort, before you leave this room, is there anything this team can help you with next as a challenge to move this forward?
Great question. I think just one is awareness of it, because it's going to touch upon a lot of the areas that are, and it has already touched on a lot of areas. Like General Counsel's been working really hard. Karen Blackwell and compliance have been key. Working with information security, because we need to pass up these limited data sets and manage that type of information. We've got to be incredibly nimble and quick about deploying things because we only have 18 months. And actually, they want to speed us up even quicker to show that we can do a trial this year. So, that's really, it's just be aware that to hit these milestones. And the other thing to point out, this is not a grant. They've structured this as a contract. So if we don't hit our milestones, we will let down the network, and sites may get cold or they may cut the funding. So that's the other thing to be aware of.
Thanks, Russ.
Okay.